Chapter 8. Controlling the Uncontrollable. It seems to me a funny thing to make rules about war. It is not a game. What is the difference between civilized war and any other kind of war? Pancho Villa. In 1827, a young German immigrated to the United States, leaving behind a turbulent career which included fighting for the Prussian army against Napoleon and a couple of spells in for his liberal views, among them firm and vocal hostility to the Prussian crown. Franz Lieber was an idealist, polymath, poet, philosopher, and physical fitness enthusiast, whose wide circle of friends and acquaintances included Jeremy Bentham, Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, and Daniel Webster. In his new country, he became a prominent intellectual and educator, among much else, editing the first edition of the Encyclopedia Americana, and ending up at Columbia University as the first ever American professor of political science, a term and discipline he helped to invent when the Civil War broke out. Lieber was a staunch supporter of the Union, but his own family, like so many others, was divided. One son died fighting for the Confederacy, and another was badly wounded with the Union forces. Lieber became head of the Loyal Publication Society, but continued his own writing, focusing increasingly on how the two sides should treat each other. He argued bravely that Confederate prisoners should be treated as combatants, not traitors, and therefore be subject to the customary laws of war. It was, he said, the moral as well as the reasonable thing to do. When a highway robber asks my purse and I, being unarmed, consider it expedient to give it, I certainly recognize the robber. It is no more than recognition of a fact. In 1862, Lieber wrote to Henry Halleck, then General-in-Chief of the Union armies, offering to draw up a code for Union soldiers on how to behave. The result, issued by President Lincoln as General Order No. 100, was a key document in codifying the modern laws of war, and much that has been done since, such as the Geneva Conventions, has built upon it. Just over a decade later in Vienna, Bertha von Suttner, a penniless but beautiful young woman from an old noble family, took a job as a governess in a well-to-do family. As such things sometimes happened, the son of the house fell madly in love with her, and perhaps she with him. Predictably, the parents opposed the marriage, and the young couple ran off together, ending up eventually in the Caucasus. Newly acquired by Russia, von Suttner's husband tried one scheme after another from a timber business, which failed to designing wallpaper and eked out a living of sorts as a writing instructor and French teacher, while they both wrote articles for the European press. She became the more renowned in 1877 when a conflict broke out between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. She saw for herself what war could mean, and increasingly devoted her considerable energies to attempting to abolish it. Von Suttner, trailed by her husband, moved westward and became something of a celebrity, devoting her time and her pen to the cause of peace. In 1889, she published her most famous novel, Lay Down Your Arms. Deep convictions but untalented, said Tolstoy of her. Overwrought and overwritten, with an improbable plot, its fervent anti-war message nevertheless resounded in a Europe which was becoming increasingly aware of the great destructive capacities unleashed by the Industrial Revolution and the growth of nationalism. Von Suttner met with statesmen, including Theodore Roosevelt, to beg them to bring an end to war, and she also developed a strong partnership with Alfred Nobel, the Swedish industrialist, an engineer and inventor. Nobel had developed new and powerful explosives, initially for mining. Armed forces around the world, however, had been quick to see their potential for better and more deadly weapons. As Nobel's fortunes had grown, so had his guilty conscience. He wished, he said, that he could develop a weapon of such frightful efficacy for wholesale destruction that war would become unthinkable. Von Suttner persuaded him rather to endow a prize for peace, and since she spent extravagantly, then lobbied shamelessly to receive it, her goal, and that of Nobel and their many like-minded allies, was to eliminate war altogether. Lieber and von Suttner represent two overlapping strands in humanity's long struggle to limit, control, or finally eliminate war. One did not necessarily exclude the other. Even pacifists such as von Suttner were prepared to work on developing laws for the making and conduct of war, in the hopes that one day human beings would come to realize that violence no longer had a place in their affairs. Immanuel Kant, who reflected much on war in his peaceful city of Königsberg on the Baltic, argued that developing internationally accepted laws on war was a step on a long and difficult journey to the goal of getting rid of it altogether, and humanity's own failings might keep it from finally reaching that ideal state. In 1913, John Reed, a young Harvard graduate already making a name for himself as a radical muckraking journalist, spent 4 months with the rebel Mexican leader Pancho Villa. Reed happened to show him a pamphlet with the latest rules of war, which had been agreed at the Hague Conference of 1907, Villa reported. Reed spent hours going over, interested and amused him hugely. Villa wanted to know more about the conference and whether there had been a Mexican representative there. Above all, he found the whole endeavor absurd. It seems to me a funny thing to make rules about war. It is not a game. What is the difference between civilized war and any other kind of war? Villa had put his finger on one of the several paradoxes that confront us when we think about war. How can we talk at all about controlling and managing something where violence is the tool in the domination, if not the total destruction of the enemy, the goal? Yet that has not stopped us from trying repeatedly to do so over the millennia. Like ants with their nests, we laboriously build up a more or less agreed structure, only to see it kicked apart by the heavy foot of war. We soldier on to reconstruct what we have come to call the laws of war. These are partly conventions and norms which are widely enough accepted at a particular time and place to have a constraining effect. The Greek city-states fought on some days and not others in similar patterns on the plains, even though the mountains around them offered possibilities for different sorts of war, and their soldiers generally stopped as the sun went down and one side was declared to be the winner. The Aztecs had their highly stylized flower wars, just as the Highlanders in New Guinea or the Yanomami in the Brazilian rainforest have in more recent times. Psychological barriers, a sense that some things are taboo or not done, can be powerful, especially perhaps when enemies are face to face. The bleak view of war is that all attempts to control and justify it are futile and pointless. As Machiavelli put it, war is just when it is necessary. Yet even the powerful and ruthless have looked for reasons and excuses of some sort to justify making war. In 1122 BC, the Duke of Zhou in northern China conquered the neighboring state of Shanghai, arguing that its ruler was a drunkard who oppressed his subjects. Heaven, conveniently for Zhou, had therefore withdrawn the Shang ruler's mandate and handed it over to the Duke of Zhou. The Old Testament is filled with references to the Israelites fighting a righteous war against their enemies. He must kill the Amalekites, God tells King Saul, men and women, infant and suckling. God himself, says the book of Exodus, is a man of war. The Greek and Roman generals usually had religious advisors who would consult the omens before going to battle to see whether the gods were promising victory. Julius Caesar, ruthless even with the gods, said, "The omens will be as favorable as I wish them to be." Aggressors have used religion as an excuse, but the fact that they call on it at all indicates both that they have an uneasy respect for its powers and that they have a need to justify what they are doing. From its early centuries, the Christian Church accepted that there was a distinction between just and unjust wars, but regarded both with disapproval. Its clergy were forbidden to fight, and laymen who had taken part in a war had to do penance afterward before they were fully back in the church. In 1095, however, Pope Urban II made war against infidels both righteous and good for the souls of those who took part. At a council of the church in Clermont, he preached a rousing sermon calling on Europe's feudal knights to recover the holy city of Jerusalem. This was God's will, he said, and the crowd shouted in agreement. He promised the salvation of the souls of those who followed the call, as long as their motives were pure. Whoever for devotion alone, said the decree issued by the council, not to gain honor or money, goes to Jerusalem. To liberate the Church of God can substitute this journey for all penance. In the First Crusade and the others that followed, crusaders took vows and were ceremonially given crosses that had been blessed. They were promised both spiritual benefits with forgiveness of their sins and more earthly ones, the Church's protection of their families and their properties, immunity from lawsuits, and exemption from paying interest on their debts. This was not the first and not the last time a transcendent purpose unleashed the basest cruelties as the unfortunate Jews of Europe, along the Crusaders' paths, were to discover. As the First Crusade slowly moved eastward, its members fell on defenseless Jewish communities on their way, secure in the conviction that they were waging holy war on God's enemies. In Mainz am Rhein, reported a chronicler, the Crusaders put some 700 Jews, men, women, and children to death from this cruel slaughter of the Jews, said a chronicler. A few escaped, and a few, because of fear rather than because of love of the Christian faith, were baptized. Religion was never entirely satisfactory in justifying war, because the gods do not always give clear directions. Oracles were notoriously ambiguous and signs difficult to interpret. The thinkers of the classical world around the Mediterranean started the process, which has gone on by fits and starts, of disentangling law, ethics, and morality from religion. In thinking about war for the Greeks, and then the Romans, a just war was one which was fought to redress a wrong or an injury. Furthermore, the great Roman orator and writer Cicero argued war was only permissible when all other means of maintaining peace had been exhausted. There are two types of conflict, he said. The one proceeds by debate and the other by force, since the former is the proper concern of a man, but the latter of beasts, one should only resort to the latter. If one may not employ the former, the conduct of the war itself should involve as little cruelty as possible and have as its aim peace. Plato, who grew up during the Peloponnesian War, argued that war ought to be fought knowing that the two sides will eventually have to be reconciled. His student Aristotle, by introducing the idea of natural law, something that humans could work out for themselves using their reason, opened the door wider to discussions about moving war away from the religious sphere into the secular world. While the hugely influential St. Augustine did not devote much of his writings in the 4th and 5th centuries A.D. to war, he reluctantly admitted its existence as part of the human condition. He accepted the Greek and Roman view that war is just when it seeks to right a wrong, or is a defense against an enemy who is preparing to use force to achieve unjust demands. Indeed, he and the equally influential St. Thomas Aquinas, several centuries later, saw something positive and redemptive in a war which enforced morality. Who decides what is a breach of morality or a threat is another matter. In the First World War, for example, all sides claimed to be defending themselves against an immoral enemy. Augustine also introduced the important proviso that only legitimate authorities could make war. The issue, Hombayan, issue, however, of what constitutes a legitimate authority is another difficult one which has never really gone away. Is a dictatorship or organization such as Daesh, or to give it the more usual name, Islamic State or ISIS one, it makes a great difference, Augustine wrote, by which causes and under which authorities men undertake the wars that must be waged. Again, like his classical predecessors, Augustine also weighed the goals of a war in deciding whether it was a just one or not. Peace, as has often been repeated, is the end of war in modern war. The shadow of Clausewitz, with his insistence that the aim of war should be the overthrow of the enemy and the growing capacity of societies to wage all-out war, have too often led countries to ignore opportunities for negotiated settlements and to carry on fighting just because they can. Saddam Hussein gave up his weapons of mass destruction after the First Gulf War and was no longer a threat to his neighbors. Was it really necessary for the peace of the Middle East to invade Iraq and overthrow his regime in 2003? Michael Walzer, whose Just and Unjust Wars is a key text in the modern debate, says many war aims can be achieved well short of destruction and overthrow. We need to seek the legitimate ends of war, the goals that can rightly be aimed at. These will also be the limits of a just war once they are won, or once they are within political reach. The fighting should stop. Soldiers killed beyond that point die needlessly, and to force them to fight, and possibly to die, is a crime akin to that of aggression itself. A rule of thumb is that the means used should be proportionate to the ends. In other words, if the goal, say a disputed bit of territory or an apology, has been gained, there is no need to go on and obliterate the enemy. The temptation, of course, is to do just that. While different cultures developed their own understandings about when and how to fight, the West, appropriately enough since it pioneered so much in modern war, has played a major role in setting international laws and rules about what its scholars called jus ad bellum and jus in bello. The first, the laws governing the initiation and justification of war, and the second, those of its conduct. Other parts of the world have adopted and adapted these, drawing on their own traditions. While feudal knights were still killing each other's peasants and putting the inhabitants of besieged towns to the sword, for example, Islamic scholars had long been developing rules for how women and children should be treated in war. The issues raised are not easy ones and have been debated for centuries and still are. What makes a war just, and who has the right to wage it? And what principles, if any, should guide the way wars are fought and ended? When it comes to the conduct of war, the questions when is it permissible to attack civilians, and how? And which ones? How should prisoners of war be treated? Or conquered peoples? Even when we think we are making headway, we find ourselves in a maze of contradictions. Why do we try and outlaw some weapons and regard others as lawful, even though the function of both is to kill and maim? Killing by firebombing or flamethrowers is considered acceptable. But ever since the First World War, poison gas or biological warfare has been widely regarded as beyond the pale, even by those who use them. Saddam Hussein gassed his own people in Iraq, but either denied it or claimed the Iranians were responsible. As long as war has existed, humans have been arguing about what is allowed and what is not, and each time we appear to be getting closer to an answer. What looks like a certainty dissolves on closer examination or throws up more questions. One principle that is generally accepted by international society is that unprovoked wars for gain or dominance are illegitimate. Self-defense, however, is not yet following the classical world and medieval thinkers such as Augustine and Aquinas. We like to think that war should be a last resort after all other alternatives have been exhausted. The miracle of Holland as the extraordinarily learned and productive 17th-century Dutch scholar Hugo Grotius was nicknamed by Henry IV of France, successfully introduced the idea that war was only just if it was waged by states to protect themselves and not by private forces. What that came to mean in practice was that opposing states could each claim to be waging a just war. Furthermore, we have come to believe governments that resort to war ought to have reasonable grounds for thinking they will prevail. Otherwise, they would be throwing away their people's lives for nothing. Some experts would add that the victorious nation should not utterly humiliate the defeated. One fine-sounding principles. But under closer examination, they raise another host of questions for philosophers, ethicists, and the rest of us to consider. Is it a just war when a nation, feeling that it might be threatened in the future, decides to wage a preventive war in the absence of an immediate threat? That was the reasoning of the German High Command in 1914, as they anticipated a challenge that might emerge 3 years in the future or not at all. And if response to an injury makes a war, just who decides whether there has been an injury in the first place, how great it is, and whether war is the only redress possible? Austria was looking for an excuse to destroy its troublesome neighbor Serbia, well before the Habsburg heir. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Bosnia. Although Austria sent a commission of inquiry to Bosnia, it was not able to establish a clear line from the assassins to the Serbian government. Nevertheless, it determined on war to avenge, in the language of the time, the affront to its honor, and sent Serbia an ultimatum that was designed to be unacceptable. Even so, Serbia accepted the majority of conditions, and a settlement might have been possible if the great powers had come together, as they had in previous Balkan crises, to impose one. Instead, Europe and the world got the Great War. The meaning of just war has gradually expanded since Grotius' time. While the Westphalian settlements at the end of the 30 Years' War of the 17th century established the principle that states did not interfere in each other's internal affairs, globalization, the spread of liberal ideas, and the growth, thanks to modern communications, of an international public opinion has stimulated and justified the idea of armed humanitarian intervention to protect the defenseless and minorities against their own governments. In the 1850s, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia provoked a war with the Ottoman Empire in order, so he claimed, to protect Christians there from unfair and brutal treatment. The prospect of grabbing territory from the failing Ottoman Empire and getting access for Russia into the Mediterranean from the Black Sea through the Ottoman-controlled straits was also a factor. In this century, the invasion of Iraq by the Anglo-American coalition was justified on humanitarian grounds, as was the more recent and largely unsuccessful American intervention in Syria's civil war. Humanitarian intervention and new doctrines, such as the right to protect, raise questions about who decides what is just, and suspicions about the motives and goals of the intervening powers. Critics, many of them from non-Western states, have argued that Western powers are simply cloaking their deep-rooted imperialistic attitudes to the rest of the world in the fashionable new language. Hypocrisy, as the Duc de la Rochefoucauld remarked, is a tribute vice pays to virtue. The West does have a long and shameful history of observing one set of rules for itself, and another for those it considers less civilized. As laws of war became more formalized in a series of understandings and agreements, those peoples, mainly non-European, who were not aware of them or who had not been asked to sign up, did not receive their protection. The civilized nations who signed the series of Geneva Conventions, dealing with prisoners of war, or the Hague Agreements on arms limitations before the First World War, were quite clear that they applied only to themselves. When Japan modernized and became a Pacific power, it was accepted into the circle of the civilized. "We show ourselves," said a Japanese diplomat, "at least your equals in scientific butchery, and at once are admitted to your council tables as civilized men and scientific butchery with repeating rifles, machine guns, and after the First World War, the new airplane was what happened to the uncivilized in Africa, Asia, the Philippines, the American West, or the Middle East. Western legal experts, politicians, and military argued complacently that peoples at an earlier stage of development than the fortunate Europeans or Americans only understood a firm hand. The laws of war, said the 1914 British Manual of Military Law, can apply only to a conflict between two civilized nations. They do not apply, it went on in wars between civilized and uncivilized, their place taken by the discretion of the civilized commander and such rules of justice and humanity as recommend themselves in the particular circumstances of the case. The 20th century brought the gradual acceptance, and we are still not fully there, that all human beings possess the same rights to life and dignity, and that international law cannot make such distinctions. The laws regulating the conduct of war as they have evolved are not a legal code as we would recognize it in domestic society. Rather, they are a compendium, as Walzer puts it, of professional codes, legal precepts, religious and philosophical principles, and reciprocal arrangements that shape our judgments of military conduct. In recent centuries, formal international agreements on the treatment of neutral states, for example, have become woven in with the codes of honor of professional soldiers or older unwritten customs about the treatment of prisoners of war, as well as with shared views on the sanctity and dignity of human life. 2. To make a web of understandings about war which can seem strong, at least as we have seen time and again. Until war comes, conventions in such areas as the exchange or ransom of prisoners of war can have something close to the power of law, especially when warring parties share a common culture. For centuries in European war, officers were usually not confined. It would be enough to ask them as gentlemen to give their word, their parole, not to escape. After Wellington's victory over the French at the Battle of Vittoria in 1813, the British officers invited their defeated French adversaries to their mess. The officers of their Spanish allies, whom the British despised, were not treated nearly so well. The notion of the officer's honor lingered on into the 20th century, as Jean Renoir's wonderful 1937 film Le Grand Illusion shows. The French officer gives his word that he will not try to escape to the German commandant of a First World War prison, but in fact, he does so in the 19th century. What had been customary or the subject of bilateral agreements between two nations, such as a 1675 agreement between France and Spain, setting the rates for ransoming different categories of soldiers, was elaborated in successive multilateral Geneva Conventions and made part of the newly developing body of international law. The International Committee of the Red Cross took on responsibility for monitoring the treatment of prisoners of war, ensuring that they received the agreed amounts of food and medical care, and transmitting letters and parcels. The Christmas truce in 1914, when the firing stopped in parts of the trenches and the opposing sides came out to no man's land to exchange toasts, sing carols, or play football, harks back at least to the medieval tradition of war being suspended on holy days. The ancient Greeks did not fight during the Olympic Games, and the most warlike among them, the Spartans, had certain sacred days when they would not fight, and there were long-standing traditions about how to declare war or sue for a ceasefire. Infamy and treachery read the newspaper headlines when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, not least because Japan had not sent a declaration of war first. When Japan broke precedent in 1904 by attacking Russian ports in the Far East without warning, Western newspapers admired its boldness. But Japan was an ally of Britain then, and widely regarded as an admirable, modernizing nation. When Japan capitulated in 1945, it did so in a radio broadcast by the emperor. But across Asia, Japanese forces signaled their surrender to the Allies through the time-honored white flag, which is still used on occasion today. Since 1945, however, in one of those inexplicable shifts in fashion, declarations of war have fallen completely out of favor. Attempts to control the sorts of tactics and weapons used are probably nearly as old as war itself. The ancient Greeks tried to limit acceptable weapons to those suitable for close combat. The historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, claimed that the Greeks had made an agreement to use against each other neither secret missiles nor those discharged from a distance, and considered that it was only a hand-to-hand battle at close quarters, which was truly decisive. In the Middle Ages, Innocent II tried to ban the crossbow, and Roger Bacon tried to bury the secret of how to make gunpowder. The most productive period, ironically, in view of what happened later in the development of the laws of war applicable to all nations, came in the decades before 1914, reflecting that 19th century mood of optimism that humanity was improving and that its darker side, including war, might be brought under control. While the foundations had been laid over many centuries in the world's religions or the work of philosophers, two main sets of rules now took shape rapidly. The first was a renewed attempt to regulate war. In 1856, the Declaration of Paris set rules about when belligerents could use naval blockades and seize goods that might be used in war from enemy or neutral ships, although it failed to define what it meant by contraband. And in 1868, the St. Petersburg Declaration prohibited the use of explosive bullets. These marked an innovation of international relations, for they were not bilateral or multilateral treaties among states, and nor had they been reached by the great powers which then imposed them, as had happened at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, on smaller states. Instead, nations were invited to join in support for a set of proposals. The declarations and the host of subsequent international agreements on war optimistically assumed a common set of values and a shared goal among peoples. In 1898, the new young Tsar, Nicholas II, sent an open invitation to the world's powers to work together to limit the arms race, which was gaining steam. Some 26 nations met in The Hague the following year to work on further regulating war. Although the arms agreements reached were something of an anticlimax, merely outlawing asphyxiating gas, the dum-dum bullet, which caused gaping exit wounds, and the throwing of projectiles out of balloons, there were other encouraging signs, including agreements on the humane treatment of prisoners of war and the creation of a permanent court of arbitration. Peace activists continued to hope that the civilized parts of the world, at least, were moving away from war. In 1907, a second Hague Conference, this time with 44 nations represented, made some minor changes to the earlier agreements and attempted to regulate war at sea, banning, for example, certain kinds of submerged contact mines which were increasingly posing a threat to shipping, both naval and merchant. In 1910, the Declaration of London finally provided a working definition of contraband. Since the British then turned around and refused to accept a declaration which they had helped to draw up, it remained on the books. The initiative started in The Hague has never died away, however, as new weapons, bombers, chemical and biological, more deadly landmines, nuclear weapons have appeared. The world has endeavored, and still does, to limit or ban their use, and individual powers still choose to ignore or fail to ratify provisions they do not like, as the British and others once did. The Hague Conventions has become a shorthand way of describing the rules of war, just as Geneva has given its name to the other main set of conventions. These also originated in the 19th century, but in this case were intended to protect the victims of war, both those who do the fighting and civilians. In 1859, Henri Dunant, a young Swiss businessman wearing a white summer suit, stumbled onto the battleground at Solferino in northern Italy, where the French and their Sardinian allies had just defeated the Austrians in a decisive battle. In the Italian Wars of Unification, the cause may have been glorious. The results were horrific. New and improved weapons had caused some 30,000 casualties. None of the contending armies had made even the most elementary arrangements for the care of the wounded who lay among the dead. As Dunant later wrote, helpless on the naked ground in their own blood. Horrified, he joined local volunteers in trying to bring the wounded water, bandage their wounds, and carry them on crudely improvised stretchers off the field. Dunant came to think that God had guided him to the battlefield that day. In his subsequent book, A Memory of Solferino, he painted the misery of war and called on societies of volunteers everywhere and their governments to undertake medical aid to all soldiers in war, irrespective of which side they were on. His work had a huge impact on public opinion across Europe at a time when many, thanks to modern communications, were becoming more aware of how badly soldiers were treated. Dunant also got support within Switzerland, which, as a neutral country, was well positioned to be impartial among opposing sides. In 1863, with the help of well-connected supporters, he established the International Committee for Relief to Wounded Soldiers, which promptly invited the European powers to send representatives to a conference in Geneva. A year later, at a second conference, 12 states' representatives signed the Geneva Convention for the amelioration of the condition of wounded in armies in the field. Volunteers on or near the battlefields were to be protected by a symbol, the Red Cross, which was an inversion of the colors in the Swiss flag. It has since been joined by the Red Crescent and the Red Diamond. In countries where it might look too much like a Christian cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross has grown into a formidable non-governmental organization. From that moment onward, successive Geneva Conventions, signed by an increasing number of nations, have amplified and expanded the original mission to include civilians as well as combatants. The idea that civilians should be distinguished from combatants and spared where possible goes back a long way into history. An ancient Indian text gave a list those who look on without taking part, those afflicted with grief, those who are asleep, thirsty or fatigued, or are walking along the road, or have a task on hand unfinished, or who are proficient in fine art. In the 12th century, the great Jewish scholar Maimonides laid down rules that banned wasteful destruction of, for example, fruit trees, or stipulated that a city should be besieged only on 3 sides, so that those who wanted to could escape. While women have often been treated as prizes in war, they have also been singled out among civilians for special treatment. "It is all right," says the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, "for you as a victorious man to carry away a woman if you like her, and will make her your wife." But the passage goes on, "If thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will. But thou shalt not sell her for money. Thou shalt not deal with her as a slave." When Lieber wrote his famous code during the American Civil War, he was drawing both on Judeo-Christian morality and long-accepted practices in European warfare. Men who take up arms against one another in public war do not cease on this account to be moral beings responsible to one another and to God. He argued, it was not, therefore, permissible in war to inflict unnecessary suffering, take revenge, wound or maim the defenseless, or use torture to extract confessions. He prohibited rape, but interestingly did not make a distinction between the sexes when it came to punishment for offenses concerning the spy, the war traitor, or the war rebel. Yet Lieber also acknowledged that he was dealing with modern warfare, where the means of destruction were greater than in the past, and the distinction between civilians and combatants was already porous. And despite himself, he was going to blur it still further. Military necessity, as understood by modern civilized nations, he said in Clause 14, consists in the necessity of those measures which are indispensable for securing the ends of the war, and which are lawful according to the modern law and usages of war. He then goes on to list the sorts of things, from people to property, that can be legitimately destroyed. Necessity, he argues, allows of all destruction of property and obstruction of the ways and channels of traffic, travel, or communication, and of all withholding of sustenance or means of life from the enemy. Indeed, echoing Clausewitz, he argued that waging war must be taken to the limit. The positive side, he pointed out, was that it might therefore end sooner. Civilians cannot always be spared. It must never be forgotten that the whole country is always at war with the enemy. Lieber's code distinguished between units of the enemy's army remaining behind in occupied territory and what he called armed prowlers and war rebels who organized themselves to attack the occupying forces. The former came under the rules of war and, if captured, for example, should be treated as any other prisoners of war. The latter were like ordinary criminals and could be put to death. Although his code was widely copied, this did not settle the issue of what to do with civilians who took up arms to defend themselves and their territory against an invading force. Were they combatants under the laws of war or something else? The question has become increasingly important in the last 2 centuries with the spread of nationalism and total war, where European governments and elites in the 18th century saw war very much as the occupation of professional soldiers. By the start of the 19th century, they were starting to see civilians as part of the war effort and as a resource. Napoleon's forces easily defeated the regular Spanish army in 1807, but found themselves fighting a debilitating and protracted series of engagements against Spanish rebels. This little war guerrilla helped Spain become what Napoleon called his ulcer. In Prussia, patriots talked of a national state of emergency when their incompetent king led the supposedly invincible Prussian army to defeat at the hands of Napoleon and organized themselves to resist the French. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, there was spontaneous resistance by the population, and landowners destroyed their own property in a scorched earth policy before fleeing. In the face of such civilian resistance, the military tended to react harshly, arguing, as they have often done since, that civilians had no business being soldiers and that acts of resistance in occupied territories are illegal. In Spain, the French refused to call the guerrillas soldiers. Rather, they were bandits and brigands. Later in the century, the Prussians, whose forebears had once resisted Napoleon's occupation, reacted with fury when the French did the same during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 in parts of the occupied French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, soon to be taken from France. German notices were torn down and isolated. German soldiers attacked. When French prisoners of war marched by, the watching crowds burst into La Marseillaise, the Francs tireurs. Those French there and elsewhere in France, who organized themselves into armed militias, were treated by the German occupiers as having no rights at all and were often shot out of hand. In a foretaste of what was to happen in the 2 world wars, communities suspected of harboring them were subject to harsh reprisals. A popular German novel later depicted the Franc-Tireurs as cowardly, treacherous, and perhaps most damning of all, ill-disciplined. As a result of their experiences in France, the German military remained set on severe measures against civilian resistance. The Army's Manual on Tactics advised franctory, are strung up on the next best tree. Without further ado, the two international conferences at The Hague raised questions which we are still debating today. When is it legitimate for civilians to attack invading and occupying forces? What can those forces do in response? And who counts as a soldier and therefore deserves to be treated under the Geneva and other conventions? And who is merely a criminal or a traitor? At The Hague, the Germans held out for the narrowest possible definition of civilian fighters, insisting that the only legitimate forces were those in clearly identifiable uniforms, and that resistance was allowable only during an invasion and not when an occupation had been established. When it came to what that last meant, the Germans suddenly wanted the widest possible definition, arguing that it was enough that the regular troops of the invading army be around, but not necessarily visible. The British, thinking perhaps of the success of the guerrilla war in Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, and the French, with their revolutionary tradition of the levée en masse, as well as some of the smaller nations, wanted to leave room for spontaneous uprisings of citizens in the face of an invasion. The 1899 Hague Conference saw a compromise. Collective penalties against civilian populations were banned, but enemy individuals who committed illegitimate acts of war might be punished. The 1907 conference spelled out more clearly what constituted a recognized resistance force. Its members must be organized, distinguished by uniforms or badges, carry their weapons openly, and fight according to the laws of war. Enough progress had apparently been made on protecting civilians for Andrew Carnegie, the American philanthropist who devoted a large part of his fortune to the cause of peace, to say in a speech in 1905 that non-combatants were now spared in war and prisoners of war well cared for. If man has not been busily striking at the heart of the monster war, he has at least been busily engaged in drawing some of its poisonous fangs. And he expected that under the blessed law of evolution, things could only get better. Like so many others before 1914, Carnegie was far too optimistic. As in earlier times, the exigencies of war tore holes in the web of laws and conventions intended to contain it. Whether the Germans in Belgium, the Austrians in Serbia, or the Russians in Galicia, the occupiers terrorized and brutalized local populations during the First World War. The actions of the British in Iraq in the early 1920s, where the new tool of air power was used to bomb rebel districts into submission of the Italian and German air forces in the 1930s, in Spain during the Civil War, or of the Japanese in China after 1937, demonstrated that as much as the international community might deplore attacks on civilians in general, and on their resistance in particular, the powers ignored international agreements when it suited them. In the Second World War, the savage reprisals carried out against civilians by the Germans, Italians, and Japanese helped to highlight the issue afresh, and there were real advances in the law during and after the war. In their 1942 London Declaration of War Crimes, the Allies defined hostage-taking, or the execution of civilians by occupying powers, as a war crime. Since 1945, a new category of war and of fighters has entered the international vocabulary: wars of national liberation. Were the members of the National Liberation Front, the FLN in Algeria, criminals, as the French maintained, or soldiers? The older provisions dealing with partisans specified that they must wear some form of uniform or visible badge. But wars of liberation also used guerrillas who, as Mao Zedong put it, swim among the people like the fish in the sea. Were fighters who pretended to be ordinary civilians protected by the laws of war? The French military's view in its long struggle in Indochina was brutally clear. "Never forget," said the motto on the wall of their counterinsurgency training school, "the enemy does not fight this war in accordance with French army rules." Was it all right then, in the name of some common good, to torture the enemy prisoners in such counterinsurgency wars? Or was that a war crime and a crime against humanity? The so-called War on Terror has raised similar questions today. Did the Geneva Conventions apply to the prisoners held by the Americans at Abu Ghraib in Iraq? And do they apply to those at Guantanamo? And in addition, were what was called enhanced interrogation techniques, a euphemism worthy of Orwell's 1984, a violation of the prisoner's human rights? Memoranda from the United States Justice Department in 2003 argued that American interrogators were allowed to do what they did. American courts and much of the public have disagreed. The debate will go on. Making the laws is one thing, enforcement another. Nations have police forces, courts, and prisons. Those who break the law can be judged and punished. The international order so far has only achieved the beginnings of such a system. And recent history is full of examples of nations breaking the laws of war when it suits them, and they think they can get away with it. Before 1939, Germany had signed up to the various protocols about treating prisoners of war, and the Nazis did observe them in the West with peoples they considered their racial equals, such as the British or the French. In the East, however, where the German forces were dealing with Poles or Russians who, according to Nazi ideology, were racial inferiors, they allowed themselves a free hand to brutalize and murder their prisoners. Even democratic regimes have found that when defeat is imminent or victory just out of reach, it is tempting, even necessary, to bend the rules. After all, it can be dangerous to fight with one hand tied behind your back. The British and the Americans overcame their initial reluctance and used mass bombings of civilians in the Second World War to try to hasten its end and spare the lives of their own citizens. Were they right to do so? The question is one which still stirs up strong disagreements. Even determining who is guilty for waging an unjust war and how such persons can be dealt with has proved difficult and is still evolving. In 1815, the great powers did not think in terms of an offense against international law when it came to dealing with Napoleon. All they knew is that they wanted him well out of the way so that he could not escape as he had done from Elba and set Europe in turmoil again. The Prussians suggested that the simplest solution was to assassinate him. But the British had reservations. Perhaps they hoped the French would try their former ruler themselves, on the grounds that, by returning to France, Napoleon had defied the new legitimate Bourbon ruler. But the French government, not surprisingly, showed little enthusiasm for this. The British fell back on declaring that Napoleon was a prisoner of war who could be held indefinitely because it was clear that he was never going to stop trying to make war. To reinforce a flimsy legal argument, Parliament passed an act saying that his imprisonment was necessary for the preservation of the tranquility of Europe. To everyone's relief, except, of course, that of Napoleon himself and his remaining loyal supporters, the British firmly removed him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died 100 years later. The great powers were again thinking of how to deal with those they held responsible for war, and they now had a more fully developed set of assumptions. The codification of various international rules about how wars should be fought, as well as arms agreements, had given rise to the assumption, perhaps no stronger than that there was an international community which ought to react strongly in the name of all human to unjust wars and unjust conduct in war. In 1915, for example, Britain and France issued a declaration to the Ottoman government that it would be held responsible for crimes against humanity and civilization for its massacres of the Armenians. When the Great War ended, the public and many of the leaders on the Allied side demanded that someone or something should be punished for the catastrophe that had struck Europe. The leading statesmen spent considerable time before and during the Paris Peace Conference debating about who among the defeated leaders and military should be tried for having started the war, and for crimes committed in its course. The obvious figure was Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and possibly some of his advisors. The Austrian Empire had ceased to exist, and its old emperor, Franz Joseph, had long since joined his ancestors in the imperial crypt in Vienna. France, Italy, and Britain agreed beforehand the peace conference opened to set up an international court. Justice said their agreement requires that the Kaiser and his primal accomplices, who designed and caused the war with its malignant purpose, or who were responsible for the incalculable sufferings inflicted on the human race during the war, should be brought to trial and punished for the crimes. The United States objected to an international tribunal, as it continues to object today to the International Criminal Court, although its president, Woodrow Wilson, did join in the speculation about where Wilhelm might be exiled if found guilty. Bermuda was too close to the United States for comfort. The American thought, and Lloyd George offered the Falkland Islands. In the end, Wilhelm remained in the Netherlands, where he had taken refuge at the end of the war, since the Dutch refused to surrender him. The Allies' loud demands for trial and punishment of those guilty of war crimes, and their list of over 1,000 war crimes said to have been committed by Germany, petered out in a few trials of German officers. The German government was obliged to hold at Leipzig. In the interwar years, humans, as they had done so often before, drew on what they perceived to be lessons of the past in renewed attempts to control or even abolish war. A Geneva Convention of 1925 prohibited trade in chemical and biological weapons, and another, in 1929, prohibited their use in war altogether. Still another, signed in 1928, fleshed out the rules governing prisoners of war. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 22 was successful for a time in cooling down a naval race in the Pacific and in setting up new security guarantees there. The London Conference of 1930 extended the Washington Agreements until 1936, at which point both Japan and Italy refused to sign an extension. The new League of Nations worked throughout the 1920s on a more general disarmament conference, which finally met in Geneva in 1932, only to collapse into impotence and insignificance when Germany's new chancellor, Adolf Hitler, pulled his country out of both the conference and the League of Nations. The scale and destructiveness of the Second World War brought renewed attempts to strengthen the international regime controlling war. The Atlantic Charter, which Churchill and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941, looked forward to a lasting peace where all nations could be free from the threat of aggression. The following year, the Allies, including the Soviet Union, signed up to the United Nations Declaration in which they promised to fight together until their enemies were defeated and endorsed the principles of the Atlantic Charter. While the Allies were looking to the future, they were also considering how to punish those responsible for the war. Germany, Japan, and Italy, it was agreed then and since, had all initiated the war. And unlike with the First World War, a legal basis to charge their leaders existed in the various pre-war conventions and agreements. The Allies already had evidence, too, of atrocities committed by their enemies during the war, although the full horror of what had been happening in the death camps, or to civilians in occupied territories, and to prisoners of war was not fully evident until the end of the fighting. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, now on the side of the virtuous, had connived with Hitler to carve up the center of Europe, and it could be argued, and has been, that the Allies had also broken the law and committed crimes in their submarine warfare and their mass bombing of civilians. The trials of German and Japanese leaders by special tribunals. At Nuremberg and Tokyo, remain nevertheless an attempt, if flawed, to bring the perpetrators of war crimes to justice. The defendants were charged with breaking international agreements and violating the laws of war, and in the case of the Germans, under a new heading of crimes against humanity. The trials also established the important precedent that it was not sufficient defense to say that those on trial were simply following orders. A commission of the new United Nations later elaborated the Nuremberg Principles, covering crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, affirmed in a resolution of the General Assembly in 1950. These have formed the basis for the further expansion of international law. And the new language and agreements on human rights have also strengthened the argument that war cannot be the excuse for armed forces to deprive fellow human beings of fundamental rights, such as the right not to be held illegally or be tortured. The challenge, of course, as it has always been, is enforcement. Since 1945, we have used sanctions or United Nations or NATO forces for peacekeeping, and we have tried to develop international law and international courts to try aggressors such as Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia. But such measures have only been effective when the powers want them to be, and when the most powerful country in the world holds prisoners illegally in sites around the world or does not accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which was set up to punish unjust wars among other crimes against humanity. Others will be tempted to follow its example. Yet we continue to hope, as people have done through the centuries, that we can do more than control war and mitigate its effects, that we can abolish it altogether. In Europe's Middle Ages, the Church tried repeatedly to impose the peace of God and outlaw war, except for the holy cause of the Crusades. From the 10th century to the 12th, bishops called on local nobles to attend councils where they would take vows not to plunder local churches and monasteries, hurt unarmed priests, or steal from peasants. The list got longer with time. Crimes came to include attacking merchants or someone on the way to or from church, or uprooting vines. In the 11th century, the Church also attempted to forbid fighting on certain days. For example, from the end of the evening prayers on Wednesdays until sunrise the following Monday, or during sacred seasons in the Christian calendar, such as Easter and Christmas. Understandably, there was much popular enthusiasm for the Church's measures, but the nobles and their retainers kept on their lawless ways, even under threat of excommunication. The Bishop of Le Puy in southern France took more effective action in AD 990 when he asked local nobles to take an oath to keep the peace and to give back what they had taken from the poor and the Church. When they refused, he called in troops he had previously concealed, and, said the chronicler, with the help of God, the nobles decided to swear the oath. After all, the Church also tried, with some success, to direct noble violence outward toward the Crusades. While religions have, like the medieval Church, a mixed record when it comes to war, certain sects have produced more than their share of anti-war activists. After the Napoleonic Wars, British dissenters and evangelicals established the Society for the Promotion of Permanent and Universal Peace, and Quakers and Mennonites have been active in anti-war movements up until the present. Others have put their hope in reason rather than religion. Christine Dupizon, a prominent poet and thinker of the 15th century, wrote that if a prince feels wronged, he should assemble a great council of wise men, and not only will he assemble those of his own realm, but in order there be no suspicion of failure, he will also call upon some from foreign countries that are known not to take sides, elder statesmen, as well as legal advisers and others. Kant, in his perpetual piece, A Philosophical Sketch, hoped that crooked timber of humanity might grow straighter in the ways of peace. The 19th century, with its evident signs of material progress, especially in Europe and the Americas, gave rise to hopes that there would be a similar transformation of the moral nature of humanity. Peace, that indefatigable crusader Bertha von Suttner wrote, is a condition that the progress of civilization will bring about by necessity. It is a mathematical certainty that in the course of centuries the warlike spirit will witness a progressive decline. Over a century later, Steven Pinker is expressing the same hope in his Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. The equally evident progress in weaponry and the growth in the military added incentive to think of ways to move beyond the use of war. Sir Henry Maine, the great 19th century British jurist, remarked, "War appears to be as old as mankind, but peace is a modern invention." True, there were still wars even in Europe, but increasingly the powers were resorting to arbitration to settle disputes. There were some 300 arbitrations between 1794 and 1914, and more than half of those were between 1890 and 1914, which seemed to indicate a clear trend. Moreover, the spread of representative government and the widening of the franchise appeared to be fulfilling Kant's hope that governments, based on the consent of the people and operating by consensus, would follow the same principles in dealing with other nations. What came to be called the democratic peace theory in the 20th century, with its assumption that democracies would not fight each other, still has a powerful hold on our imaginations. Even though history offers examples of countries with a fair degree of democracy, such as Germany and Britain in the First World War, fighting each other, by 1914, many Europeans had come to think of war as obsolete, something that only the less civilized did. Looking back on his childhood, the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig recalled, "People no more believed in the possibility of barbaric relapses, such as wars between the nations of Europe, than they believed in ghosts and witches." There appeared to be sound economic arguments against war as well. As the British journalist Norman Angell pointed out in his wildly popular The Great Illusion, war no longer made economic sense. In the past, nations had fought each other for loot in the modern world. They got what they needed at much less cost through trade and investment. The nations of the early 20th century were so economically interdependent that a war would hurt even the most powerful among them, and that interdependence should be encouraged. Free trade was not just good for all, it brought good. As the great British radical of the early 19th century, Richard Cobden, had said, "Free trade was like gravity in keeping the earth stable, drawing men together, thrusting aside antagonisms of race and creed and language, and uniting us in bonds of eternal peace." A similar hope lay behind the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions at the end of the Second World War, and again behind the U.S., pushed to lower international trade and investment barriers after the end of the Cold War. The world was being knitted together before 1914 in other ways, too, through travel. The second half of the 19th century saw both mass tourism and mass movements of migrants, and by the growth of international organizations, from the International Committee of the Red Cross to the Inter-Parliamentary Union. By the start of the 20th century, there was an International Peace Bureau in Bern, and also peace crusades and peace petitions. The two disarmament conferences in The Hague drew hordes of observers, including von Suttner, whose hotel flew a white flag in her honor, and a Russian financier, Ivan Bloch, who handed out copies of his massive study of war, which showed how it would be madness for the advanced powers to fight. "There will be no war in the future," he told his British publisher, "for it has become impossible now that it is clear that war means suicide." Although few countries had yet given them the vote, women were increasingly active in the peace movement, and were going to be again after the First World War. In Britain, in the 1920s and 1930s, the Women's Cooperative Guild, with its 72,000 members, was a strong supporter of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. WILF and women were active in the Peace Pledge Union. The WELF eventually had chapters in 50 different countries after the Second World War. Women peace activists were involved in the campaign for nuclear disarmament in the 1950s and 1960s, and in the 1980s ran their own women-only demonstrations to protest against the deployment of American cruise missiles in the United Kingdom, most notably at Greenham Common in Berkshire in Northern Ireland. Betty Williams and Mairead Maguire, formerly Corrigan, founded the Community for Peace People in the 1970s after witnessing sectarian violence firsthand. In 1976, they won the Nobel Peace Prize. We always need to remember, though, that other women have been cheerleaders for war. The statesmen, and increasingly stateswomen, have not always liked it. But from the 19th century, they have had to deal with international public opinion, and as the franchise widened in many countries, more and more voters at home. When Tsar Nicholas II suggested the first disarmament conference in The Hague, his fellow heads of state and their ministers were not particularly enthusiastic. Conference Comedy said the Kaiser and Edward VII called the idea the greatest nonsense and rubbish I ever heard of. The public felt otherwise. A petition in favor of disarmament in Germany, for example, got over 1 million signatures, and so the powers agreed to send delegations to the Netherlands. The German one, which included a professor who had just written a pamphlet condemning the whole peace movement, was under orders to oppose any measures that would impede Germany's ability to wage war. The British, whose delegation included Admiral Jackie Fisher, who was in the midst of overhauling and strengthening the Navy, refused to contemplate any measures that would affect their ability to use a blockade in war. The Americans expressed support for peace, but said that their own forces were so small there was no point in limiting them. And perhaps Tolstoy had a point when he criticized arms limitation as a dangerous diversion from the real cause, which was getting rid of war altogether. In War and Peace, on the eve of the Battle of Borodino, in which he will be mortally wounded, his hero, Prince Andrei, reflects on attempts to make war less cruel. But playing at war, that's what's vile. And playing at magnanimity and all the rest of it, that magnanimity and sensibility is like the magnanimity and sensibility of the lady who turns sick at the sight of a slaughtered calf. She is so kind-hearted, she can't see blood, but eats fricasseed veal with a very good appetite. They talk of the laws of warfare, of chivalry, of flags of truce, and humanity to the wounded, and so on. That's all rubbish. Or, as the slogan of the Interwar Peace Pledge Union put it more tersely, wars will cease when men refuse to fight. Memories of the First World War and growing fears of another one gave renewed purpose and vigor to those who would abolish war. The League of Nations, said President Wilson, and many around the world agreed with him, was the only hope for mankind, an organization of free nations, he told the Senate in July 1919 when he presented the Treaty of Versailles, which incorporated the League's covenant, would make wars of aggression and spoliation such as this that has just ended forever impossible. The League of Nations would provide sufficient collective security for its members to deter attacks by outsiders and sort out disputes among its members peacefully. If members refused to engage in discussion or submit to arbitration, Wilson believed the solution was economic sanctions. No, not war, but something more tremendous than war. Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force. Wilson also hoped that international public opinion would serve to isolate and shame aggressive nations. Although the United States did not join the League, its representatives worked closely with League bodies in Geneva, and public support for ending war remained strong throughout the interwar years. In Britain, the League of Nations Union had 400,000 members by the start of the 1930s. some 11.5 million British men and women, nearly 40% of the adult population, voted in a peace ballot held between 1934 and 1935, providing huge majorities in support of the League and disarmament. In 1928, the French Foreign Minister, Aristide Briand, and the American Secretary of State Frank Kellogg created what many at the time hoped would mark a giant stride for humanity away from war. Nations signing their Pact of Paris promised to renounce war as an instrument for settling disputes among themselves. Eventually, 61 nations signed up, including Germany, Italy, and Japan. There was, as skeptics pointed out at the time, no way of enforcing the pact. And the outbreak of war in 1939 showed that they were right to be skeptical. Under pressure from President Roosevelt, Allied planning started during the war for a new body to supersede the League and for new economic organizations, which, it was hoped, would help to knit the world's nations together and minimize the danger of future war. In April 1945, just after Germany's surrender, but while the fighting continued in the Pacific, 46 nations met in San Francisco to create the United Nations. It has not lived up to its promise of getting rid of war once and for all. That was always too much to hope for. But it has brokered a series of arms limitation agreements and has helped through peacekeeping and peacebuilding and the activities of its various bodies, such as the World Health Organization, to mitigate and alleviate some of the effects of war. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, which followed the Second World War, again focused humanity's attention on the dangers of war, which certainly, by the 1960s, was threatening to bring the long story of human beings to a close. Novels, films, and television programs, such as On the Beach, Dr. Strangelove, and The Day After, gave terrifying pictures of the impact of nuclear war and the ease with which it might occur somehow, and that is more to do with the nuclear balance between the two superpowers. During the Cold War, the possibility of mutually assured destruction, with its all-too-apposite acronym MAD, meant that the United States and the Soviet Union avoided going to war with each other, although at times they came close. That does not mean that the world has been free of war since 1945. The superpowers and some lesser ones fought proxy wars and fueled, as they still do, civil wars and violence need not be committed by the latest high-tech weapons. Out of date, cheap weapons can do great damage. In Rwanda, before Hutu militias started their slaughter of the Tutsi, the country imported enough machetes for every third Rwandan male to have a new one. Those machetes were not used for farming. As we look around the